Welcome to your 12-minute HR lesson. Today, I want to talk to you about outgrowing simple solutions. I want to talk to you about one example of where a good way of doing things is good for so long, but then we start to see some gaps in it. Hopefully by the end of it, you'll be able to see when you can up your game, when you can outgrow a simple solution, how you can see one simple solution that has its limitations, and hopefully you'll be able to apply it to others. So let's go. So last week I got both intense and abstract on you. This week I want to give you something really useful, something very practical for you to work with. But before we get there, I want to set your mind the way I want you to think about these things. And to do that, I'm going to talk to you about the concept of the flawed mentor that we see throughout fiction. This is an archetype, and archetypes helps our brain to follow certain patterns, to follow certain lessons. The archetype goes like this. You have a mentor, you have a guide, you have a father, you have a mother type figure that takes the unmolded clay of our protagonist and builds them and strengthens them and guides them, and they are the rock the protagonist needs for them to get where they need to go, but also protect them from the harms and the threats that they are under. They are the Gandalf, the Merlin, the Dumbledore, the Robin Williams characters from both Good Will Hunting and Dead Poets Society. They are perfect guides until they aren't. And often in these stories, there's a little flashpoint in which we see their humanity, we see their emotions, we see their hubris and their limitations, and both us and the protagonist realize this person is human. They are not just a two-dimensional figure of knowledge and virtue and protection and strength. They are human, they have limitations, and the purpose of this flip, this flaw, is to show us that it is time for our main protagonist to grow up, to fly the nest, to go out on their own and seek themselves for strength and success, not our mentor. It's that flip, that sign, that failing is how we know it's time for our protagonist to go. If you're not quite with me, think about Dumbledore in The Half-Blood Prince when they're trying to get the first Horcrux and they're in the cave and he's drinking in order to get down to the locket, and he has to drink and he doesn't want to. And I think there was another prior sign, but that to me is the most clear sign. Dumbledore is now human. Dumbledore knows what he ought to do, but he can't do it. He doesn't want to. His wants and his needs and his fear is overriding his logical and virtuous brain. Dumbledore is human. It is time for Harry to lead and Dumbledore to follow. It is time for Harry to take the initiative. So what's the abstract concept that I'm going to use to bridge here to some real solid takeaways? What I want you to take away from the concept of the flawed mentor is transpose the mentor with model or ways of doing things. When we're starting out early in our journey as either managers or as HR professionals supporting managers, in our early days, models are great. They give us answers, they give us support, they let us grow and they let us learn. But as we get more experienced, as we get more sophisticated, as we grow, we start to see the limitations of those models / mentors. And then we need to recognize when they're not helping us anymore and we need to step away from them. But recognize that they are very useful most of the time, and that just because we have found gaps doesn't mean that they don't work. So you could end the lesson there. Everything has its limitations. After a while, if we really want to grow, we have to start setting aside simple solutions to understand that they don't always work. Best practice can get us a long way, but after a while, we need to level up. And to level up is to go it alone without simple, comforting, structured models telling us what we ought to do. What I want to talk to you about is something I'm essentially going to be strawmanning. But recognize that it's useful a lot of the time. And that is what I would describe as biggest cheerleader management. What I'm trying to convey there is that there's a sense in our current workplace and current environment that we encourage through our dialogue, through our stories, through what we celebrate. There is an expectation that managers should be employees' biggest cheerleaders. They should grow, they should nurture, they should build, they should support. They should find the way to bring the best out of those people, and on the sidelines cheering and clapping and encouraging and heartening them to try their hardest and get there. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's limited. So what's the limitation of the biggest cheerleader model? To put it really simply, it discourages corrections. It sets a higher bar than preferable for what a manager should be addressing with their employee. Let me put you in a scenario. You're a manager, you've got an employee, you're getting feedback from one of their internal customers that things aren't going right, things aren't working well, nothing major, a general discomfort and unhappiness. Ideally, what we want is this to be addressed. Doesn't need to be made a big deal. This can be handled with low-level critique and correct and adjust management. Very simple. Very simple, but often doesn't happen. So why? Critique and correct seems to run contrary to this expectation of support and encouragement. How can you do both? It can be done, but it feels difficult to do both. It feels contrary. What this creates is a perception or a mindset by the manager to not sweat the small stuff. What is the problem with that? What is the limitation with that? Bearing in mind, it's not the end of the world. This is not entirely bad. This is not a fatal flaw. This is not a hole in the ship that says don't do this. But it's a limitation. I wrote an article on this a couple of months back, in which I talk about the need to heat up cold and cool down hot. What we tend to get with managers is avoidance, sudden escalation to frustration with an employee who is not doing what they ought to be doing. And when we look at it, we go, well, hang on, this has been going on for some time. Why has nothing been done about it? And potentially at the root cause of it is the manager didn't want to sweat the small stuff. They didn't want to address it. But on the other hand, it was there. It didn't stop, and it built up, and it got frustrating. And this is how we get into these escalation situations where ideally what we wanted to have done is dealt with this 6 months ago. And now we're 6 months down the line and we've got storm and teacup situations. Now I can hear some of you out there and rightly saying, hang on, you're asking us to throw out good stuff. And I completely agree. The human relations school of thinking really shifted us away from quite draconian master and servant relationships. It's brought us forward in huge leaps and bounds about treating humans as humans and taken away a lot of unnecessary pain and trauma and allowing adults to treat other adults like adults rather than this parent-child relationship that we used to see. So in no way would I say, let's get rid of all of that human relations way of managing people. What we need to do is recognize those limitations and encourage people to nitpick. We need to encourage managers to run the risk of nitpicking. We need to ask them, and this is hard, this is complex stuff. that we need to encourage them to find a way of correcting and adjusting and addressing early without coming across as nitpicking, without running the risk of bullying. That's hard, but we need to do it. So hence we need to change our language, and we need to also change our mindset. The consequence of the more that we talk about growing and nurturing and building and supporting and cheerleading, the more we are raising the bar of what should be addressed. That is the unfortunate consequence. The more we push down that line, the more that we raise the bar as to what a manager is likely to consider addressable. Something I keep coming back to is recognizing the right tool for the job. This is a good example of how sometimes we start to realize the limitations of the tool. The better that we get, the better that our managers get, the more that we really start to hit the edges of how these tools work, how these approaches work, and we start to see how they start to fray at the edges. This is an example of how Harry outgrew Dumbledore, of how Will, i.e. Matt Damon, outgrew a psychiatrist, Robin Williams, how he drove west in search of a girl. Sometimes when we're trying to work out what's the best way of dealing with the situation, we need to leave and drive west to find that girl. Okay, I know what you're thinking. How did Good Will Hunting end? Is that what happened at the end? There's something to do with he leaves a note for Robin Williams and he leaves Ben Affleck sitting at his porch. Maybe you need to watch that film again. The only movie or trivia I've got about it is that Robin Williams ad-libbed the line, "Son of a bitch stole my line." But anyway, thank you for listening. Hopefully you find this useful. If you want to check out our courses, pragmatichrm.nz. If you want to check out our consultancy services, pragmatichrm.nz. If you just want to read our article, have a look. They're all free. If not, not a problem. The only thing that I would ask, please share us or please promote us in all those little micro slacktivism ways that you can. Any likes, any shares, any reposting helps us find other people that we can help. Otherwise, I'll catch you on the next one. Thanks.